everyone. Welcome back. The third and final round. And we get to turn it a little more inward. Although I just want to say I have so greatly enjoyed this morning with all of you. It's been so good. Yeah, we've had wonderful presenters. I have not been at this event before, and no, my impression is that many of you probably don't know each other in this room, and yet we've had such great dialogue and ideas thrown around. I've learned so much, and it has already felt a bit like self-care, even though we've been talking mostly about caring for our students. So I'm grateful for this time together. And now we officially pivot to caring for ourselves. We have been talking mostly about caring for our students, and we get to talk about caring for ourselves. And so we're going to start off with this part by Joe and I modeling what we've already talked about with vulnerability and authenticity with our students. And we're going to model a little bit about what we want you to do in a minute, which is reflecting on how this pandemic has affected us. Because Heather talked about trauma. We're going to talk a little bit more about trauma, but we have gone through that trauma as well. And it's important for us to take a moment, to take lots of moments, and reflect on how we've been affected, for better and for worse, because there are silver linings, I hope, as well. So on the back of your blue handout, there's self-care bingo on one side. We'll get there later. On the other side, it's sharing, or reflecting, sharing, and listening. And so what we're going to model in a short version up here, because we are trying to stick to our time, is interviewing each other. And we have 3 questions in the box. And the purpose of this activity is to not only reflect, but to practice compassionate and attentive listening. And so we want this to be a little bit maybe more formal in the sense that the person who's going to be interviewing first actually asks those questions. I know I do a similar activity in one of my psych classes. Actually, that reminds me, I don't know if I introduced myself officially. I teach in the School of Nursing primarily. I teach public health, but I also teach for the Department of Psychology, and my background is as a psychiatric nurse practitioner and therapist. So this session actually feels like my 2 worlds of public health and mental health coming together. How did the public health arena affect our mental health, right? Okay, so back to this. So my intention here is that we will ask each other these questions. It's easy to just read them off the paper and go on your own, but to actually ask, to look at another person and say, hey, how are you? How has this affected you? And let that person fully have the space to respond. I don't know about you, I'm one of those people in interpersonal situations where I often step back and do a lot of listening and don't share unless someone actually intentionally asks me. And so this is the opportunity to be asked and to be listened to, and then to play the other role. Everybody's gonna have a different level of what they're willing to share, what they feel comfortable sharing, and that's okay. Share what you can or what you feel comfortable sharing. But we're gonna start.
And I get to interview Monique, so. So Monique.
Yes.
Thinking back on the pandemic, what has been one of the hardest parts of it for you?
So many things. Joe knows I have 3 children, ages 12, 8, and just about 5. And all were in Zoom land. Well, not my youngest. My youngest was with Miss Emma Ossing right here at our Early Childhood Learning Center. Praise the Lord for that. But my other 2 were Zooming away for a little over a year. And I was learning how to teach on Zoom and all of the things that many of you were also trying to learn as well. And my husband also teaches here, so he was in that world, and it was just, wow. All, 4 of us on different Zooms in different rooms of our small house, and trying to keep my first grader engaged. He's rolling around the floor, playing with his Legos. I'm trying to keep him in his Zoom class. He turned the camera off constantly so that I can go up to my bedroom and Zoom, right? I imagine this is a reality for many of you. That was so challenging.
So given all of that, what is one of your coping skills that you used?
So I think one of the best things that my husband and I did, especially during lockdown, was like in the early stages, was set up a schedule, and then part of our alternating work schedule was creating an hour of alone time, which usually I use to run or walk or call a friend or something. And so knowing that like at 4:30 every day, that was my hour, 4:30 to 5:30, I was going to get out of that house away from my work and my children and go and run or walk in my neighborhood was life-saving. Yeah.
And so 4:30 was not Brandon's
No,
alone
he
time.
had
Oh, okay.
he had the early morning because he is a morning person and I am not. Yeah.
And so what's a lesson that you learned that you want to take away to remember from this time?
So I often reflect on how I have a really bad case of FOMO. If any of you are familiar with FOMO, so it stands for fear of missing out. And I have a really hard time just not saying yes to everything, whether that be work, whether that be social experiences. I want to do it all. If you're familiar with the Enneagram, I'm a 7, and it can be fun and it can be really draining. And the pandemic took away my FOMO because there was nothing to miss out on for quite a long time. It was very, very helpful. I found a lot of restoration in the rest that I was forced to do. And I want to keep that. I want to keep that perspective of like, you're actually going to be a much happier, healthier, sane person if you don't try to do everything that's available to you.
Awesome.
Yeah. Lots of deep breaths here. Mm-hmm. All right, so my turn with Joe. Joe, what has been one of the hardest parts of the pandemic for you?
For me, in my job here, I became an instant expert at things I don't know anything about. And I'm sure that you can relate to that. But the pressure from that was unbelievable in the beginning when all this happened, and I was in charge, I put myself in charge of getting everyone up to speed on how to use Zoom, had I been on Zoom at that point? I don't even know, but I had to become the expert. And discussion boards and just so many things that I had just these moments of panic, which is very unusual for me. Really unusual for me, but that was the hardest thing, is being in charge, being the leader of something that I don't know anything about, or very little about.
Wow. And so, yes, deep breath. And we're here.
And here we are.
And here we are. So what is one coping skill that you utilized during all of this?
Well, I have to say that I do a lot of self-care. I do this stuff before the pandemic, through the pandemic, and throughout the pandemic. One thing that I really locked onto was trying to find a sense of normal. Anything that was normal, like going out for a walk. Okay, I have to wear a mask, but just getting out, trying to continue to exercise, to continue. I'm very fortunate, I live close to campus, and so I kept coming into work most days. My office was empty but me, so I didn't even have to wear a mask when I was in, but I just, and I continue to do that. Life is not normal, but I look for normal, and I seek it, and I prioritize it.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. And so what is a lesson that you learned that you hope to carry with you?
Wow, am I amazing?
Yeah.
I know that sounds terrible to say that, but just, you need to be in awe of what you just did.
Yes. Amen.
And if I talk to you about that and listen to your story, I get teared up listening to I'm in awe of what you have done. And all of our professors. We have been through a lot, and just to be in awe, and to kind of own the fact of what an amazing learner you are. of what we have learned, done, been leaders in something that's very uncomfortable, but we just have to do it. We don't have a choice, and we've done it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. You're all amazing. Wonderful. So now is the opportunity for you to do that with each other. So my hope is that you can find either a partner, or there might be groups of 3, that's fine too. But to take turns, someone being the person who asks the question, someone who gets to answer. Again, share at your comfort level. And so we'll spend about 10 minutes or so doing that. Whew, it's so good, so lively. Because not only have we gone through a lot, but most of us have gone through this professionally alone or somewhat alone, right, in some silos, haven't been able to be face-to-face in a professional arena for a long time. So I hope that was a beneficial experience to be able to share and learn from each other. Okay, so we're talking about trauma, and I have this here. You may have heard this reference before. Is it big T or little t trauma? It's up for debate, depends on your personal experience, but I just want to clarify, the word trauma does get used a lot these days. It's a very important word, but I think for people who, there may be people, and maybe people here that are like, come on, do we really need to call everything hard a trauma? And so there's been this differentiation that we often use in the mental health world. Well, it could be a big T trauma, and often the working definition that we use in psychiatry and psychology for big T trauma is when someone perceives, and Heather talked about this idea of perception, when someone perceives that their life or someone they love's life is in danger. And to be quite honest, living in a pandemic, that big T trauma definition works for many of us. But there's also little T traumas where we're experiencing major stressors that can really throw us off and have a lot of the psychological and physical experiences that Heather referenced earlier. So I just want to clarify, it can be either, and it's not dependent necessarily on the actual experience. It's the perception, it's what's going on underneath our skin. And so it's going to be different for everybody. And so I kind of want to just briefly talk about a few things that we're hoping to cultivate with our students, with ourselves. This has been mentioned already with Heather and Lisa. We're hoping to cultivate resilience. Also a term that I think is quite catchy these days. I personally love this body of research. This notion that we can learn, and this is a learned skill. Yes, there may be genetic or environmental components that can help us be resilient, but it is something we can learn and get better at where we bounce back. And it's dependent on our own internal resources, what we've got going on inside of us, but also our external supports. It's hard to be resilient alone, so we need both. I love that the definition identifies that we're bouncing back. It is not that we are just smooth sailing through our struggles. We get knocked down, sometimes repeatedly, but can we bounce back up? And so cultivating resilience is something that we can hopefully do to help us experiencing the most damaging effects. It doesn't mean that I'm going to build up all my resilience and power my way through, and then I'm for sure not to experience damaging effects of trauma, such as depression, anxiety, etc. But it can help sometimes. The other area that kind of goes along with this in psychological research is this notion, I love this so much. We often talk about post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress in general, but what about post-traumatic growth? There is a growing body of research that some people can come through really damaging parts of trauma and actually develop a wonderful new perspective on life. Not to say that they come out unscathed. By no means have they not experienced any great difficulty, but there's other things that can happen as well. This is maybe what we could consider the silver lining. And so I have here the 5 different areas. And for me, this really resonates. Things that as we did our interviewing, we're trying to come out of this and think about, what do I want to take with me? What's something I've learned through this? And so for me, yes, absolutely, an appreciation of life. Life seems a bit more fragile and uncertain than it did a year and a half or 2 years ago. Appreciating the days that we've been given. For me, I have really strengthened some key relationships in my life through the pandemic in the struggle together. Other relationships, I had less bandwidth for all the relationships in my life, but there were a few that really got strengthened. Perhaps there's new possibilities, new ways of doing things, certainly professionally. We've learned how to, in an instant, I got for example, myself this semester, I'm like, I got to go to a conference mid-semester. I can throw my class online for a day, and that doesn't seem like an overly daunting task like it once would have. So there are new possibilities and ways to do things. Certainly, as Joe identified, we have done really hard things. So being able to identify our strengths and what we've come through. And hopefully there's been some spiritual change. As with any trial, unfortunately or fortunately, it usually takes the hardest trials to get me to come to a new sense of connection with God, and really brings me to my knees, both literally and figuratively, a whole lot more than when things are going well. And so that can be another lesson to pull from this too. So I want to take a few moments, and these words have already been thrown around, but I imagine that for many of us, or other people, where there's negative connotations, there's misgivings, there's hesitancies about terms such as self-compassion and self-care. And so just wanted to give you a moment in your pairs or your small groupings, talk about that. What comes to mind? Are there positive things? Are there I don't know about this? Or just talk about that. So we'll just give you about 2 minutes to do that together, and then we'll come back. So good. I'm learning so much from you all. Okay, so just to have a more clear definition, and you're all throwing out ideas of what self-compassion, what self-care looks like for you. Essentially, if you had to describe it to someone, it's treating yourself as you would someone you love. This is a picture of your mirror image of yourself hugging you, right? This is especially poignant for me when I think about the self-talk that goes on in my head. It's often quite negative. I'm often beating myself up about things that I didn't get done that I should have, or things I could have done better. And sometimes it's a helpful exercise to stop first and pay attention to that, and then think, would you ever say that to your loved one, whether it be a child, a spouse, a close friend? Hopefully you wouldn't say those kinds of things, but yet we treat ourselves that way. So it is a different way of viewing ourselves and how we take care of ourselves. There's 3 major categories. This is all kind of detailed out for you in a handout. What color? Purple, lavender as well. But there's 3 main components of self-compassion I'll just quickly go over, and then we're going to do a short writing exercise to practice these things. But the first is mindfulness. The first step is just getting in touch with what you're thinking, that inner self-talk, and what you're feeling. Sometimes that is the hardest step, forcing yourself to be still and to feel the feelings. I mentioned earlier I'm an Enneagram 7. Of all the Enneagram numbers, we are notorious for not being in our heart and our bodies. We are all up here. We do a lot of ruminating. It's really hard for me to actually feel my feelings. I even want to. I say I want to. I love, as a therapist, I love to talk about it with other people. But when it comes to actually being still and paying attention to my own feelings, that's just not natural for me to do. So this is a really important piece, is to just feel it. And then find that balance I have here between the negative rumination and the unrealistic positivity. So finding a way to have a more objective stance on what we're feeling. So first, pay attention, feel it all, and then start to hone in on, okay, I'm feeling this, but not going down just awful negative thinking forever and ever, amen. And also not doing what actually I tend to do, which is go too far on the positivity side, which then keeps me ignoring the hard stuff. So there is a balance in there. The second piece of self-compassion is this idea that we are in this together. We have a common sense of humanity. And there's 2 parts of this. First, we're not alone. Certainly you are not the first person to experience the hardship that you have or feel what you're feeling. And also, your pain is not unique, because for some of us, we get overly dramatic with our experiences when we're just really in a hard spot, and we want to think that, we're not alone, but no one could possibly understand. like my pain is unique. I certainly feel that way at times. And that's not true either. And so the common humanity recognizes that there are people to support us, and also we're not the first one to go through it. And then the third piece is self-kindness. This is just a constant practice, and I say practice because it will take our whole lives to be good at this, at least for me it will, of choosing grace for ourselves over berating ourselves. And that is, again, coming back to often what starts in our self-talk in our heads, paying attention to the words that we're using to describe ourselves, the way we're thinking about our own actions or behaviors, and deciding instead to give ourselves grace just as we would give a student grace, a child grace, a close friend, a significant other grace. And then we're going to talk about this in a second, but finding healthy ways to self-soothe. So something I often talk about with my students is self-care and self-soothing are not necessarily the same things. Often when people think of self-care, I think, as Emma said, I don't have time for that, right? And often people think of things like getting regular massages or shopping for yourself, getting nice clothes, or going out to nice dinners, or going on vacations every month, like all of these big extravagant things. And those can be caring for yourself, but I would say that those are more examples of self-soothing, kind of the more immediate. Or another example that my students will often use is just binging on Netflix with a carton of ice cream. Like, yeah, that's great. That's great. Is that self-care? Maybe, in moderation. But self-care is also an idea that we are caring for ourselves in the best, most holistic, healthy ways possible. So if you're doing that every night, probably not good self-care. If it's in a really bad situation for one night, perhaps. But that's more of an immediate self-soothing. So just want to create that differentiation. And so I want to practice this. This is not a talking exercise, so this is not something you're going to have to share to anyone. But you should have a handout that just says notes. And so what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you take about 3 minutes and write down however you want, sentences, bullet points, however you want, because again, you're not going to share this. An experience that you're currently having that's hard, maybe something you're worried about as we start this academic year. It could be a personal, professional struggle of some kind. Just write a little bit to kind of get yourself in that spot. So we'll take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll keep going. If you're still writing, that's okay. I'm going to walk on to our next part of this prompt. And we're going to practice the 3 aspects of self-compassion. So the first aspect is mindfulness and finding that balance between negative rumination, unrealistic positivity. So I want you to just kind of look at what you've written, your description, and write down in maybe a sentence or two in an objective way, I'm feeling such and such because of such and such. So paying attention to the feelings, bad or good, and I don't even like to say that. There are no bad feelings, right? I always used to tell my kids in therapy that there's no bad feelings. So hard or positive, there are feelings. So name that and just name it objectively because of whatever. So take a minute to do that. And now we'll move to the second step of self-compassion, which is recognizing our common humanity. So you might want to, again, look at that situation that you're thinking about, that you've described, and then write a sentence or two acknowledging the common humanity of that. Perhaps you know someone else who has gone through this similar thing, or maybe you just need to write a note of encouragement to yourself, like, you're really nervous about this, but you're not alone. You have such and such as a support. So some sort of statement that calls out your common humanity, that you're not alone in this. And the last piece of this prompt is practicing self-kindness. So one more time, I want you to look at that description, but now I want you to pretend as if this is a loved one that is experiencing whatever it is you wrote down. a dear one who has just written this down and shared it with you, what would you want to say to them? How would you want to encourage them? And so write a sentence or two, talking to yourself in the third person. So for some of you, this exercise may have felt incredibly awkward. For some of you, maybe it's felt really warm and supportive. All experiences and responses are okay, but I hope that this has gotten you to begin to think about, if you haven't thought about it before, what that mindset can be like, what that way of living can be like, to offer that consistent compassion to ourselves that we hope to offer to others as well. Because in reality, if we're not able to care for ourselves well, we are not as able to care for others well, right? You've probably heard this analogy. I feel like everybody in the mental health world often uses it. You get on an airplane, they talk about how if you have to have the oxygen mask, you have a child next to you, you put it on yourself first before you put it on the child. And that is because you cannot help others if you are not healthy and able as well. And so to me, that's a huge way to advocate for self-care. And that's what my next slide is here. It's what it is not. It is not indulgent. It is not selfish. We do this not only because we are God's creation and we want to care for the one body, mind, heart we've been given, but also it will make us our best selves in the world around us. I kind of already talked about how it is not self-soothing. Self-care is more of a big picture of ways that we are caring for ourselves that are healthy. Self-soothing can be that ice cream and binging on Netflix or shopping online or whatever, and that can soothe in the moment, but not always long-term self-care. You know, as came up earlier, and I definitely feel this way often, it's only for those who've got the time or the money. And yet, when you think about the self-care practice that Lisa walked us through, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, that's something that she said she did while driving, right? So that's not necessarily extra time that we're taking out, but it's a way to be mindful and to practice paying attention to ourselves and to the world around us. And then we think about it from a biblical perspective. This verse in 1 Corinthians 6 says, "Do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own." Just another way to make the case for how important it is that we care for this one body, one mind, one heart that we've been given. Just as we talked about self-care practices for students, we're going to do a little self-care bingo real quickly in a minute. They can feel, and I love how Lisa and Heather have talked about this, they can sometimes seem trite, but it is the small things done regularly that are making investments into your ultimate health that then pours out onto others. Small things can make a huge difference. Okay, so before we do our final wrap up with a short meditation, I just want to point out to you, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to point this out to you. Self-care bingo. This is something that Joe got. The website's on the bottom, and then Joe and I kind of played with it and adapted it a bit. If you notice on the top, it spells out bingo with the different categories, breaks and boundaries, inward and intentions, etc. So just another simple tool. Lisa gave us some great tools as well to think about small ways when we don't have a lot of time or money to invest in ourselves. And so my hope for you is that you would kind of take a look at it, cross off if there's anything you've actually already done this week. Hopefully there's something so that you can be like, hey, I actually did do something to care for myself. And then maybe think of another thing that you'd like to focus on next week. So I'd like to conclude our time together by coming back to stillness. I'm going to lead us through a very short meditation, and then Joe will pray for us. Thank you for your attentive presence. Thank you for all that you've shared with each other, with the entire room. It's been such a gift to be with you. Such a gift. So, get comfy. Wiggle around a bit if you need to. Settle into position. And then let your eyes either fully close or kind of come to just a resting place. Take a few deep breaths to kind of just settle in. Drop down into your body, as I like to think of it. If you've been up in your head, let's drop down in. If you feel comfortable, you may put your hand over your heart to remind yourself that you're bringing not only attention, but loving attention to your experience. Feel the warmth of your hands, the gentle pressure of your hands. Feel how your chest rises and falls beneath your hands with every breath. Now bring to mind a person or other living being, could be a pet, who naturally makes you smile. This could be a child, your grandmother, your cat, your dog, whomever naturally brings happiness to your heart. Could even be a bird outside your window. Let yourself feel what it's like to be in that being's presence. Allow yourself to enjoy the good company. Now recognize how vulnerable this loved one is, just like you, subject to sickness, aging, and death. Also, this being wishes to be happy and free from suffering, just like you and every other living being. Repeat softly and gently in your mind these words. May you be safe. May you be peaceful. May you be healthy. May you live with ease. If your mind has wandered, return to those words and the image of the loved one that you have in your mind. Now add yourself to your circle of goodwill. Think for a moment these words in your head, focused towards yourself. May you and I be safe. May you and I be peaceful. May you and I be healthy. May you and I live with ease. Visualize your whole body in your mind's eye. Notice any stress or uneasiness that may be lingering within you. And let us take a moment to offer kindness to ourselves. May I be safe. May I be peaceful. May I be healthy. May I live with ease. Now take a few breaths and just rest quietly in your own body, savoring the goodwill and compassion that flows naturally from your own heart.